Hey guys, so I thought I'd go into a little bit more detail as to like the different organelles in the cell. So I figured I'd start with the membrane since that is something that surrounds the cell, right? It's the border between the outside and the inside of the cell. Okay, it allows the cell to maintain something called homeostasis. That's like the maintenance of a stable inside kind of environment. And so, in order to do that, I thought, I don't know, what do I have around the house in this COVID-19 stuff? So I was like, all right, I got this, and I made like this could be my example of a cell. So it's a little critter keeper. There's actually a little critter in it right now. I'm about to put him into a fish tank. See him right there? Um, so anyway, it was here because I was about to do something with it, and I'm like, yes, it works. So the membrane around the cell is this like thing that keeps bad stuff out, lets some good stuff in, right? And there's different ways it can do that. So in a previous video on class stuff, we talked about osmosis, diffusion stuff, okay? So here's the deal with the membrane. Things can pass through it, okay? Small things like oxygen and carbon dioxide and water, okay? And they can pass through it without the cell doing any work. So this, well, you'll notice right here, along the edge here, there is some little tiny holes, and that allows air to pass through it. So whatever's in here can breathe, right? It allows CO2 to get out of it. And you know what? If I, and this is filled with water, was to, tip it a little bit. Oh, there it goes. Water came out, right? So water can pass through this thing. Air can pass through this thing. Things that are tiny enough to fit through the spaces, the gaps, can fit through it, okay? And I don't need to open or close any doors or anything like that. That's kind of how the membrane works. So water can pass through it, air can pass through it, stuff that the cell needs and wants to get rid of. But what if the object is big? I don't know. Doesn't quite fit through, right? You need some sort of doorway, okay? So cells do this with something called active transport proteins, okay? Now, active is telling you that it needs to use energy. And think of it like a door that can open and close. And in order to open and close the door, you need energy to do it, okay? And this just happens to have a doorway, okay? So you can pull it, you can use some energy and open it up, right? And take a big thing that wouldn't normally fit through. I have like a little leaf here from my daughter's art project, and that can now go in. Can come out, okay? So things can get let into and out of the cell through an active transport protein, okay? So that's kind of my little analogy. We got a little watery inside that is different than the outside, surrounded by a barrier that is what we would call selectively permeable. It lets certain things in and out. You can open the door and close the door and only let certain things in and out, okay? So that's kind of my example of the cell, and it just happened to be lying around because I'm putting that little cute little loach into an aquarium today. He's a good cleanup crew. He'll keep it nice and clean. So there you go. That's my cell membrane analogy. And just to show you kind of what a cell membrane is made of, here's what it's made of. They're called phospholipid molecules, and they are big, long molecules. They have these tails on them that are non-polar. So polar means they have like a little bit of a charge, a positive or negative kind of end. And water has a positive and negative charge. Okay, I'll show you that here in a second. This here is a water molecule. It's made out of an oxygen and two hydrogens, hence H2O. And the oxygen really, really, really wants those electrons. So it pulls pretty hard to bring those electrons into its outermost shell. Okay, and we have to watch a whole nother video on why molecules and atoms bond together. But when it does that, the electrons on this end of the hydrogen, well, the one electron, seems to spend most of its time close to the oxygen. And that means that the hydrogen itself, its proton with a positive charge, is kind of over here, and it develops this kind of like pole, this positive area and a negative area. And the same thing with the other hydrogen on the other side, because its electron is spending most of its time over here near the oxygen. Now here's the deal with the oxygen. It's got 2 extra electrons kind of like hovering around itself, so the oxygen part of the molecule ends up getting 2 kind of extra electrons with a negative charge, so the oxygen itself takes on this kind of like net negative charge. And if you look at the molecule now, it's got a negative end then and a positive end. So it's like a magnet. Okay, negative and a positive. And water is sticky. Like you ever put your finger in it, it sticks to your finger. It sticks to your clothes. Water is sticky because it's polar. It has a positive and a negative end, like a magnet does. Okay, so if something is not polar, it doesn't have that stickiness, that positive and negative end. And that is the phospholipid tail. You can see that right here. It's a tail and it's non-polar. Okay. Now, lipid. Well, let me show you that. Let me tell you what a lipid is. Any class of organic compounds that are fatty acids, or their derivatives, and are insoluble in water. Look, they're like a fat, okay? And if they have kinks in their tails, they can be more like an oil, okay? But what do you know about oils and fats? If you put oil in water, they don't really mix, and that's because oil is non-polar, which we just talked about, right? So going back to our phospholipid here, if you have multiples of these molecules, they end up lining up like this. The tails, which don't like water, will stick together because they don't want to be in water. Like if you put these fats in water, they will line up this way anyway. Okay, so these non-polar ends line up together. They get the water out in between them, and they can touch other not watery things, and that is good. Okay, and the other part of the molecule is the polar head, and that's a phosphate type head. It's polar. It likes water. It's happy to be around water. So those are okay being on the outside of this layer, I guess, that's formed right here. So what you get in a membrane is these polar heads, which are fine touching the water on either side, and a barrier with no water in between. That barrier is the membrane, okay? That barrier is the membrane. And now you know a little bit more. Hopefully you're a little enlightened.